Immersion by Lou J. Berger. Narrated by Todd Waits. 5 minutes after I got the call from Chief Inspector Megan Clark, I was in a cab. 10 minutes later, it settled in front of the Immersion Center. I waved my pad near the cab's payment slot and got out, already walking away as it flew up and merged with a local traffic pattern overhead. I hated Clark with every fiber of my being for what she'd forced me to do over the last 3 years. My only alternative was a bullet to the back of the head, so I went when she called me. I wanted her dead, without her boot on my neck. Across the street, a massive arcology straddled the entire block like a giant overhead Christmas tree, metal girders strung together with walkways, its thick struts supporting hundreds of rusted-out, cobbled-together living quarters like shoddy ornaments. People streamed down the staircases, a tide flowing across the street, eager for the next Meld fix. Clark had been curt on the phone, her clipped voice barking that I was needed immediately. There were rumors that somebody might try to infiltrate that night's Meld. The Immersion Center had been built inside an old-fashioned movie theater, renovated for the purpose. I walked around the corner of the building and along a line of people waiting to enter. A woman, her voice pitched low, admitted to her friend that it had been 3 days since her last Meld. Her friend gasped. Melding enables direct mind-to-mind interaction. The participants like bees in a hive, everybody's individuality subsumed for the greater good of the aggregate. It was cathartic, unifying, and unbelievably addictive to a certain mindset. For me, participating in a Meld is repugnant. I prefer the actuality of the world, how it really is, over the too easy, addictive nature of merging into a hive mind. Clearly, it works for other people, but I'm terrified of losing myself in the collective groupthink, even for the limited duration of a Meld. I flashed my badge at the security guard at the door and asked for Clark. The guard jerked a thumb over a muscular shoulder. Cordoned by a velvet rope, a line of people anxious to Meld moved along the interior wall. Clark stood at the center of the lobby, glancing between her pad and the queue. Her police uniform was immaculate, as always. As I headed toward her, I wondered if she ever wore anything else. Then her angry green eyes spotted me. The same eyes that, 3 years ago in the snow, had gazed down at me dispassionately, her ultimatum heavy in the air. Work for her, or take a bullet to the brain. My choice had seemed easy at the time, but not so much anymore. When I reached her, she gave me a cold stare. "Baxter, where were you?" "Sleeping. You should try it sometime." My tone was harsher than I'd intended. I'd been dreaming about something wholesome, something good, stirring feelings I'd not had much of lately. The details skittered away. Her tone hardened even more. "I don't need your attitude, okay? Just do your goddamn job." I hesitated, white-hot rage burning in my chest, then shoved my pad at her. She thumbprinted it, authorizing my work for the evening. I moved away, but her heels, clicking like a metronome, followed me. I didn't slow my pace. "Baxter," she said, catching up to me, "it's not like you have room to complain. You're still alive, and I'm even paying you." "Not nearly enough." My voice dripped with venom. The house lights dimmed, and a deep voice announced that a new Meld would begin in 10 minutes. The crowd pushed forward in anticipation, and I went upstairs and into the control booth. Our sector wasn't the only one where Discord had lowered productivity. Since Clark had arrested me, I'd helped her grab over a dozen freedom fighters. She'd sent them off for rehabilitation to cure them of their fanatical ideations of individuality, and none of them had reached out to me after their rehabilitation. I didn't blame them a bit. I'd helped send them away to be broken and forced to adopt Clark's vision of compliance. It didn't matter that I agreed with their points of view. I had to follow Clark's orders, or she'd shoot me in the head. That was my life anymore. She came in behind me, into the control booth, her voice loud in the confined space. We can always renegotiate, you know. I'm your only agent, Clark. My jaw ached from biting back harsher retorts. Don't I always get your terrorist? She looked at me with shrewd appraisal. Do you think it's him? And by him, she meant Paul. My mentor, the person who had introduced me to the subversion that had, eventually, ended up with me down on my knees, in the snow, Clark's pistol pressed against the back of my head. I hadn't seen Paul since I'd been captured. To keep him safe, I hoped to never see him again, if for no other reason than it gave Clark an excuse to let me live. I didn't answer her, and instead focused on getting ready. I set up the programmable console and throttled down the Meld's hypnotic allure to protect myself from sinking in too deeply. In order to prevent anybody from detecting my individualized presence in the Meld, I made my station passive, with no outbound signal. I pulled my personal visor out of my pocket and placed it on the console's surface, plugging the trailing lead into one of the upport ports. Call me old-fashioned, but I prefer hardwired interfaces. Wireless ones can be detected, tipping off the bad guys. Clark peered through the window at the people taking their seats in the cavernous chamber below us. The immersion chamber had been formed by consolidating the smaller individual projection rooms of an old-fashioned movie theater into a single massive arena. An enormous darkened projection sphere, visible from every seat, hung from the chamber's ceiling. Advertisements for local businesses currently scrolled across its face, but would shut off when the Meld began. The deep voice spoke again, announcing that the Meld would begin in 5 minutes. People hurried into the chamber, grabbing their favorite seats and slipping their visors on. They really are like little children, Clark said, with a hint of haughty superiority, desperate for their daily ration of feel-good. I can't blame them, though. I do love the feeling of a good Meld, don't you? I ground my teeth, but, again, didn't respond. Melds were just a touchy-feely electronic escape for people whose real lives were bittered treadmills of despair. The sensation of losing myself in a sea of petty humanity into the minds of the sheep amongst us was anything but relaxing for me. Below us, the lights faded. How long will this one last? I asked. Clark checked her pad. It's a full immersion, 90 minutes. Any longer, and permanent catatonia sets in. She raised her eyebrows and pointed at my visor, still on the console. I shook my head. I'll wait. I'll prefer to join after it settles. She sat up, put her visor on, and leaned back in anticipation. The sphere lit up, a brilliant glow illuminating the chamber. A calm voice reminded the participants not to eat or drink and to remain seated during the Meld. I watched Clark resist the electronic intrusion into her mind, then slump as her shoulders relaxed. Everyone resisted the Meld. At first, it's an atavistic, instinctive attempt to maintain self-identity. It's hard to deliberately merge with a hive mind, no matter how many times you've done it before. Shouts echoed from within the chamber as some of the participants resisted surrender, gradually quieting as they surrendered. The Meld formed. The initial phase of a Meld is similar to an orchestral tune-up, a harsh blend of overlapping sounds formed from various individual instruments. While a trained ear can isolate the boom of a timpani, can separate the glissando of a warbling flute from the yearning cries of a French horn, an untrained ear hears only cacophony. I put on my visor and dove into the newly formed Meld. The Meld matured, becoming a unified hive mind made up of all the participants. Like individual starlings swooping together in a murmuration, each mind in the room unconsciously shifted to work in unison with the others, moving first in one direction, then another. It's the very synergy of the Meld that creates the addictive rush. The resulting flood of validating endorphins drives people to return again and again, hooked on the sense of belonging that a Meld provides. I felt the familiar lure of integration and dialed down the input. I needed to stay focused. The Meld strengthened. A romantically linked couple wondered if they should get married.
You think we're ready?
The Meld revealed the couple's true selves, diving deep into their innermost thoughts, casting aside their protective illusions of how they wished they were, and unlocked their deepest motivations. After mere seconds of analysis, the Meld liked what it saw and approved the union. The couple's immediate, joyous reaction suffused the Meld, like red dye billowing through a crystal-clear pool of water, causing a cascade of self-congratulatory well-being to reverberate throughout the chamber. A retiree on a fixed income begged for advice.
What should I do?
His concerns evaporated with an influx of perfect solutions from the Meld: work options, thrift store locations, and cheap apartment opportunities overhead in the arcology. With a typical Meld efficiency, problems were solved at lightning speed by a unified superbrain, stronger and wiser than any individual within. I checked my watch. 60 minutes left. I tried to remember the dream Clark's call had interrupted. Something about sunflowers. I'd stood in a field of them, trying to convince somebody that I was doing the right thing. That part was strong. Then the memory fluttered away again, just out of reach. No anomalies had manifested on my control board. I glanced over at Clark, curiosity getting the better of me. With a few quick, subtle commands, I isolated her signal, bringing it through my wired visor. Feelings of satiety and joy radiated from her upper mind, but there was an undercurrent down in her cortex of fear and doubt. I probed a little deeper, and a wave of deep anxiety broke loose, filling me with sympathetic dread. I weighed the option of probing deeper to get something I might use to extricate myself from my situation, but decided it would be too dangerous. I pulled back. Whatever she was going through, it was none of my business. I brought back the metered Meld input, closed my eyes, and immersed myself. With the problem-solving tasks complete, the Meld had relaxed into its deepest level, the purest, most basic essence of human consciousness, the participants drifting in a whirlpool of warm bliss. This was love, distilled and injected, feeding directly into the deepest parts of our combined minds. This was the ultimate reason why people chose to Meld. It was the new opiate of the people, and our government was more than willing to provide this experience for free, since it resulted in a population of satiated, docile workers. I snuggled down into the midst of it, relaxed but alert, enjoying a rare respite from my own self-imposed imprisonment of cold, emotionless anger and resentment. 73 minutes after instantiation, a subtle yet powerful individual presence infiltrated the Meld. I jerked upright at the intrusion, my warm reverie drained, and flew into action, trying to localize the intruder. I dumped incoming data streams into isolation channels, split them, then split them again, chasing the intruder's unique thought signature. He was good, using the same techniques Paul had taught me: glacial calm, a deft touch, and relentless, focused intent. He'd waited until the deepest part of the Meld to make his presence known, which took patience and maturity. The intruder was as good as I remembered Paul being. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. Could it be Paul? Would he dare risk coming out in public? I glanced at Clark. Her eyes were still closed. She was lost in the meld, unaware of the intrusion. I focused on the console. The intruder asked permission to converse. The meld grumbled assent, the collective's response languid but receptive. "Why do you want to be like bees, forming a hive of commonality?" he asked. "Don't they sting?" He flashed an image of a young woman covered in bees, her mouth open in a silent scream of pain. He then inserted an authoritative conclusion. "Collective minds cause pain, even death. Embrace your individuality." Then he disappeared. Clark frowned, her eyes tightly shut, no longer blissful. I stood and looked down into the chamber. People stirred in discomfort, their arms and legs twitching, restless. The love feelings had been interrupted too early. The meld shifted again, and he reemerged, now suggesting that individuality was the highest possible version of freedom. The audience, trusting as only the meld-struck can, dissected the concept and embraced it, echoing the benefits of individuality over the artificial comfort of allowing others to rule your life. I was dumbfounded. He'd just convinced them that they were living a lie, and they had agreed completely. "This guy is really good," I muttered. My fingers flew as I continued trying to isolate his location. "Enslaved people are trapped," he said. "Individuality brings freedom of choice. The individual thinks for herself, rejects groupthink. Sheep work harder, pay more taxes, die earlier." The meld absorbed his points and accepted them, repeating them like a mantra. Discontent solidified, building in intensity, dark patterns interweaving and coalescing. In mere seconds, vague uneasiness in the meld solidified from scattered opinion into unified conviction. Had the meld been healthy, it would have discarded the concept of individuality as antithetical to its very existence. Melds can't form with stubborn individualists in their midst, but 5 minutes had gone by and still this argument persisted. The meld faltered. I ground my teeth and looked down into the chamber again, scanning the crowd. No familiar face stood out. If it was Paul, after all this time, I didn't want to find him, not with Clark nearby. She'd arrest him, and I so desperately wanted him to stay free. I swallowed my self-loathing, again, at not having told her to shoot me in the head, and touched Clark's shoulder. "Hey, the meld is compromised." Clark opened her eyes, her expression glassy and unfocused. She moved slow fingers and removed her visor, placing it on the console. "It is?" she asked. She didn't seem to be fully alert. She fingered a tendril of hair behind her ear, her expression blank. I scowled and snapped my fingers in front of her nose, startling her. "Pay attention, okay? Somebody hijacked the meld. He's somewhere down there." She craned her neck, looking through the window. "Where, exactly?" I'd narrowed his location down to a section near the rear of the theater, but just as I locked his location down, we hit the 90-minute mark. The meld dissipated. I smashed my fist on the console in dramatic frustration, trying to make her believe I was trying to help and not stalling for time to let Paul, or whoever it was, escape. "Come on," I said, then ran down the stairs, trying to lose her. I wanted him to get away, but I had to make it look good. The crowd, dazed and meld-struck, shuffled through the exits. I pushed through them, shouldering people aside, then ran around the building, past the line already forming for the next meld. Skidding to a halt near the rear entrance, I pointed my pad's camera lens at the door and recorded the line of people leaving. The people leaving the theater looked vaguely disgruntled. They were supposed to be awash in endorphins, but the Meld hadn't remained in the love stage long enough. I saw some grumbling and pushing, and a brief fistfight broke out, but was quickly stopped by security. I thought I spied a familiar face, but it melted away in the crowd. Could it have been Paul? Clark, having finally become fully alert, caught up to me. "Did you see anything?" I shrugged and turned off the pad. I'd look at the recordings later and use facial recognition analysis to get some names. Nothing yet. I couldn't isolate him in time. He knew just when to start, how to steer the Meld, how to fade away. "It's Paul. I'm sure of it," she said, her voice hard as iron. "If you find him, tell him I'll make him a deal, like I did for you, Baxter." Not waiting for a reply, she stomped away. I took a cab home, soaring over the vacant surface streets of a slumbering city, thinking about my old friend, and hoping he was far away from Chicago, somewhere safe. But I knew better. 12 hours later, I sat in a red vinyl booth and ate a Plasta-wheat burger, trying like hell to remember how real beef used to taste. The diner, Rosie's, was an anachronism, a throwback to the last century, owned by a man in his 80s who simply refused to modernize. The paved city streets, once bustling and packed with noisy vehicles, now sprouted weeds and trash while vehicular traffic flew by overhead. I was the only customer. The line cook kept coming from in back and glancing at the wall clock, no doubt waiting for his shift to end so he could join the next Meld. I bit into a soy fry and thought about Paul. He'd found me 6 years earlier, before the Meld had rendered most religious attendance obsolete, at one of the churches I'd been visiting in a vain attempt to dampen an ever-present malaise. After the service, he'd approached me in the parking lot. "Hey, I'm Paul. I see you're new here. What's your name?" "Baxter." "What's your first name, Baxter?" William." "So, William, what did you think of the service?" His grin had been wry, his eyes twinkling in merriment. I shrugged. I'd been attending that particular church for about a month, but there was still an empty void inside me. "All right, I guess." His eyes searched mine. "Not enough, eh?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Join my book club. We meet Tuesday evenings." He handed me a slip of paper with an address on it. I stalled for a couple of weeks before finally giving in and going. What could it hurt? 6 guys and a woman sprawled on mismatched sofas and chairs in a basement, talking about books nobody read anymore. They were good people. There was laughter, and we liked each other, pretty much. It wasn't great, but I kept going because of Paul. He was different in remarkable ways. He burned with a passion for maintaining the sanctity of individuality and argued with a devout conviction that the nobility of the human mind is vaster than anything else. He preached the glory of self-direction and the responsibility of mankind to remain free from the shackles of obligatory servitude. After a year, he invited me into the resistance. That was when my training began in earnest. Paul taught me how the then-new Meld worked and what it was doing to society, how it was destroying individuality, what it did to the brains of the weak-minded. In a very short time, I became a brutally effective Meld manipulator, disrupting Meld several times a week, right up to the night Clark finally caught me. She'd thrown me against a brick wall on a snowy evening, her knee in my back, wrenching my arms behind me. As her steel cuffs bit into my wrists, I'd whipped my head around in protest. Paul stood in front of the crowd that had gathered to watch my arrest, his face flickering with reflected red and blue flashes. He'd stared at me, distraught, before silently turning away. I hadn't seen him since, and the void in my life was like losing a limb. He went into hiding, afraid of what I might divulge, how I might potentially betray him to save my own life. Clark gave me a no-win choice in front of that crowd. Work for them, help round up other resistance fighters for rehabilitation, or take a round to the back of the head. Decide now, or else. I chose the coward's way out, and I knew it with every undeserved breath I had taken from that moment on. Clark slid into the booth across from me, shaking me out of my reverie. "So, what have you found?" I pushed my pad across the table. She picked it up and read the list of names the facial recognition software had produced, then touched the screen to cross-reference them to their addresses. "You've mapped them out?" "Yeah." I shoved the last bite of Berger into my mouth. People don't like to commute far. They tend to stay in their own neighborhood. I stood up and dropped some bills on the table. That was another thing I liked about Rosie's. They still took real money. "Come on, let's find our guy." "Where?" "Up." We stepped outside and she leaned back, shading her eyes as she peered up through the arcology framework, dirty living spaces trapped in steel lattices like flies in a spider web. "Wow," she said. "You think Paul's up there?" "I doubt it, but I think the guy who disrupted that last meld probably is." I used my pad to summon a cab. One spun down and settled nearby. The mechanoid driver swiveled his head around to point optical receptors our way. "Where to?" Some clever person had drawn a crudely shaped phallus on its right cheek, aiming toward the grill where a mouth would be. "All the way up." Rosie's fell away beneath us as we climbed. Most of the people on my list lived in the stacks, among rusted girders supporting apartment pods. Braided, interlocked cables anchored the structure. It swayed in the wind, but the latticework supporting apartments, stores, and dirt farms was strong. Looming like a mushroom over the old city, the arcology provided an enormous volume of cheap living space atop a tiny footprint. It looked jumbled and irregular, but it functioned with a curious efficiency. Wind-driven generators sprouted from it like trees, their wide arms constantly spinning. Solar cells' black eyes shone blindly as we ascended. Beyond us, the moon hung, bloated and pale on the horizon, looking odd in the light of day. We stepped out on the top level, and the cab dropped away, returning to the local pattern half a mile below. The first thing you notice when visiting an arcology is the stench. Cooking smells, rich and spicy, wafted between the pods, contrasting with the harsher odors of sewage and meth labs. Wind between the pods carried the scents upward, swirling this miasma around us, bathing us in the sense of humanity: garlic, feet, sweat, and ammonia. We moved methodically through the list, knocking on doors and working our way down the structure, interviewing several of last night's Meld attendees. Always the same questions with the same answers. "Sure, the Meld was great." "No, nobody's suspicious. I didn't notice any problems. What's this about?" I was surprised to find so many people at home, but it made sense once I thought about it. Most had skipped work. Some complained of a malaise, others of feeling underappreciated. A day off won't hurt anybody, right? The point of the Meld, from the government's view at least, was to encourage a worker ant mentality. Last night's Meld had been compromised, so nobody walked away satisfied. An hour or so into our search, we met a woman with a small, dirty child perched on her hip. She straddled the apartment doorway, her thick legs supported on bare feet. She glanced first at Clark's uniform, then at her expensive pad. Her lip curled in derision. "Look at you, officer. You think your cute figure is going to last forever, huh? Wait until you wind up here with the rest of us. Clark looked at me, her eyes widening slightly. I glanced into the apartment and noted the sparse furnishing. Just a couple of chairs and a couch. No bookshelves, no television. Eat, sleep, work, and Meld. I spoke up. Ma'am, we were curious about last night's Meld. Did you notice anything wrong? The woman glared at me, ignoring Clark, tiny eyes buried in her pudgy face like raisins in a cinnamon roll. Yeah, it was different last night. I noticed. What do you expect? It's the government. What did you think? Would you say that it left you satisfied? She snorted, and the child on her hip grinned, revealing stained teeth. Nah, not really. It ain't been good in a long time. Pablo keeps pushing me, but I can't seem to get to work hardly at all anymore. Them bastards at the plant don't appreciate me anyway. Screw 'em. They can find somebody else to push around. At her mention of Pablo, a cold hand clutched my heart. It was too close to Paul to be a coincidence. I scanned the list, trying to shield my reaction from Clark. She tapped her pad, frowning. Pablo? The lady ignored her again. I gotta go. My lunch is burning. I wanted to leave anyway. Yes, of course. Sorry to bother you, ma'am. Clark and I walked down the ramps to the next pod. A thin, rusted chain along the walkway, the only thing separating us from open space and the hard pavement far below. The city sprawled beneath us, a mass of derelict buildings punctuated by gleaming new government structures. Seagulls wheeled over a garbage pit, and, even from this height, I could see children foraging in the mounds of trash. Their shrieks rose through the thin air. Who's Pablo? She asked, her voice edged with steel. I consulted the list on my pad, frowning for effort. I really don't know. There's no Pablo listed here. She grabbed my arm. I turned reluctantly, not meeting her eyes. Baxter, she said. I shook my head and set my jaw. Baxter! I faced her, angry. I don't know, Inspector. I'm done for today. I'm going home. I think it's Paul, she said in a quiet voice, her eyes searching mine for verification. I turned away, not answering her, and hurried down the ramp, leaving her far behind. I concentrated on my feet as they boomed down the metal ramps, heading for dirt. I thought it was him, too. I hoped it wasn't. I went back, alone, an hour later, and knocked on the woman's door. Oh, it's you again, she snarled when she saw me. She craned her neck. Where's the hottie? I'm sorry to bother you again, ma'am. You mentioned someone named Pablo earlier, and I couldn't find him in the neighborhood. Do you happen to know where he is? I have some routine questions for him. Nothing serious. He isn't in trouble. She squinted at me, and I smiled, waiting for her to decide if she should help me. She rolled her eyes and shrugged. Whatever. Down 2 levels, then head south. Look for the teal mural. Thanks. After she closed the door, I pulled my stunner from the small of my back, then searched it for a tracker. Clark liked to keep tabs on where I was at all times, and I always tried to find her trackers and leave them in awful locations. Not finding one, I checked the weapon's charge, made sure the safety was engaged, then tucked the weapon back under my jacket. I ran down 2 ramps and turned south, weaving between rusted bicycles, planters filled with brown weeds, and a kid's cracked plastic swimming pool. The side wall of an abandoned shack was entirely covered in blue and green paint, a portrait of a man riding a bicycle, and a thick scrawl of red paint forming a word. Think. I picked my way through shattered wooden pallets and an overgrown patch of weeds to the front door and knocked. Pablo. Hello? You in there? I heard scuffling inside, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal a familiar face, pale skin, wide eyes, and a mop of tangled gray hair. It was Paul. My heart hammered. He didn't recognize me. "Hello, Paul," I said, my voice sounding calmer than I felt. "Open the door," said a stern voice from behind me. I whirled around, crouching in readiness, my heart hammering, already knowing who I'd see. Clark stood there, only a step behind me, a badge in one hand, her gun in the other. I scowled. I thought I was alone. I thought I'd found and destroyed all her trackers. Paul opened the door all the way, his eyes opening wide when he saw the gun in her hand. He licked his lips. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice calm. Clark stepped up beside me. I looked into the apartment, noting the overly full bookshelves. He'd done his best to hide his true identity, but he couldn't leave his books behind. They were a clear giveaway that, in this apartment, lived a deep thinker, somebody always reaching for more rather than settling for the least amount possible. Tears stung my eyes. Paul's life had just changed for the worse. "You know what it's about, Paul," I said, my voice almost gentle. "You want to let us in?" His eyes widened when he finally recognized me. "William," he moaned, clearly shocked by how I'd changed. No longer was I his star student, standing beside him, fighting against evil. Today, I was the agent of his capture, an inevitable reprogramming. He turned and ran, heading for a door set in the back wall. My stomach knotted in despair. With a sigh of tormented regret, I pulled my stunner and shot him, twin wires leaping from the weapon's muzzle and embedding themselves between his shoulder blades. Paul froze, mid-leap, crashed into a couch, then rolled to the floor, his body bucking from the electricity. A dark stain spread across the front of his pants. I knelt beside him. The stunner reeled in its darts, and the weapon hung loosely in my hand. "It's okay, Paul," I said, my voice gentle. "You're only under arrest. Clark will make a deal with you, keep you safe, like she did with me." He rolled his eyes at me, then up at Clark, standing behind me. How can I trust you?" His teeth chattered, and a thin trickle of blood seeped from the corner of his mouth. He must have bitten his tongue. "It's really not so bad." A gun fired by my ear, and something splattered against my face. A bullet hole, edged in blue, appeared in Paul's cheek, shattering his jaw. One eye pointed inward. I leapt away, wiped my hands across my face, and stared in horror at the blood coating my palms. Paul screamed, clutching his ruined face, but I could barely hear the sound. Clark stepped over him, straddled his torso, and aimed straight down into his chest. Even with ringing ears, the sound of the gunshot was loud in the small apartment. Paul's body jerked once and then grew still. His broken face slackened, and his hands went limp, falling to either side of his torso in a gentle pose of surrender. I collapsed to the carpet, my legs jelly, unable to tear my eyes away from the bloody spectacle that had once been my mentor, my friend. My voice cracked. "Why did you do that?" Clark holstered her weapon. "What did you think would happen? We were going to slap him on the wrist and say, 'Bad man, now stop'?" I closed my mouth, mind racing. No trial, no due process. I tilted my head up at her, unspoken questions pushing at my lips. He didn't do anything dangerous. He simply voiced his opinion. He had the right to his opinion. Not in a Meld. He can say whatever he wants to his friends, but nobody skews a Meld. It's the law, punishable by death. You know that, Baxter. My eyes darted around the room. books, posters of old movies, delights of a creative mind, joyous in expression, yet unwilling to meld. A man with passions and hobbies just like mine. Someone a lot like me. I stood up slowly and my knees wobbled. "Did you kill the others?" Clark grew still. She picked up a book, opened it, then carefully placed it back on the coffee table. Her voice was gentle. "Oh, Baxter, you thought—" A wave of despair surged through me as I realized, finally, what I'd been deliberately ignoring this entire time. She'd had them all killed. My voice came out ragged. "They were my friends. I brought them to you." She took a deep breath, then let it out with a heavy sigh. "You knew what you were doing." She frowned in confusion at my horrified expression. "You must have known." I wiped cold sweat from my brow. Part of me, I guess, had always known the truth. I'd been too scared to accept it. I looked over at Paul's motionless body and clenched my teeth. I'd failed him. Worse, I'd failed myself. Her eyes looked concerned. She reached a hand to touch my face. I didn't want her to touch me, not with hands that so easily ended innocent lives. I hated that I'd ever let myself believe her to be merciful. The ice around my heart melted, and rage flooded through me, filling my veins with cold fire. My hand tightened on the stunner, then lifted it. The darts hissed out on compressed air, embedding themselves in her chest, blue sparks arcing as they discharged a full load into her body. 10,000 volts turned her into a twitching marionette. Clark fell to the carpet, next to Paul, her lips pulled back in a rictus of pain. She grew limp and fell unconscious. The stunner reeled in the darts, then thrummed as it recharged. I tucked it into my waistband. I looked down at her unconscious body, then at her gun. Picking it up, I pressed the still warm muzzle against her forehead, my finger sliding toward the trigger. One pull, I thought. 6 pounds of pressure. I could end her tyranny over me. Let chemistry and physics do their split-second thing. All the things she'd done to me, the constant fear, pushed me to end her, to take away forever her right to hurt me again. I held the gun pressed tight against her skin for a full minute. Paul's gentle voice echoed in my mind. "William, certainly you aren't going to throw away your individuality in a moment of blind passion, are you? You're better than that. Don't let other people and their self-centered decisions take away the rights to your self-determined destiny." I stepped back. On Clark's forehead, the white circle of skin where I'd been pressing the muzzle slowly darkened to an angry red. I stared at the deadly, blued steel of the gun in my hand. Briefly, I considered taking it, then decided not to. Instead, I unloaded it, tossed the rounds over the arcology side, and left the empty weapon on the floor by Clark. Stumbling down the ramps toward ground level gave me little time to think. When she awoke, Clark would be angry. She would come for me, with murder on her mind. I had to get far away from her. I ran through Chicago's deserted downtown streets. Flickering shadows from the overhead traffic sped across the sunlight-dappled road in front of me. Thoughts crowded my mind as I jogged. I'd killed the allies I should have protected. I may not have pulled the trigger, but I'd engineered their slaughter, handing them over to their deaths, and turning a blind eye to the reality of what it was I'd been doing. My shoulders loosened as I moved, the late afternoon sunlight soaking through the thin fabric of my shirt. My breathing fell into an easy rhythm as I tried to envision what would happen if Clark found me. Would it hurt when she shot me? A 3-year delayed round to my traitorous skull? I didn't deserve to live, I knew. I'd sent innocent men and women to their deaths just to protect my own pitiful existence. Unbidden, a mental image of Paul's country farm leapt to mind. The place where he'd trained me, just 6 miles outside the city. A place of rich, growing things. A red barn, a tranquil pond, and sunflowers. A place to escape. Sunflowers. A whole field of them. My interrupted dream manifested in stark clarity. It had been Paul standing in the field of sunflowers. I'd been trying to tell him how important the work I'd been doing was, trying to convince him that I was helping, not hurting. He'd been silent, his expressive eyes staring at me in horror. I'd been trying to convince him that I was still good, still worthy of his respect, but he hadn't believed me. Now he was dead, and his farm called to me. He wouldn't be using it again, but I could. I could hide there, regroup, see if I could find the others, the ones still in hiding, the ones I hadn't had killed. Maybe they needed somebody like me, if they'd ever forgive me. Fields of sunflowers beckoned. I ran, my easy stride, and, for the first time in months, I breathed deeply of clean air, seeking freedom down the long road ahead.